I always believed Thanksgiving was about family, not the food, not the decorations, not even the traditions. To me, it was about sitting around a table with the people you love and feeling like you belonged. At 63 years old, I had spent most of my life creating those moments for others. I cooked the meals. I hosted the gatherings. I made sure everyone felt welcome, especially my son. From the day he was born, he was the center of my world. And maybe that's why what happened that Thanksgiving hurt so much. I lived several hours away, but when my son called and invited me to spend Thanksgiving with him and his wife, I felt excited. It had been months since we'd spent real time together. "Come stay with us," he said. Simple words, but they meant everything to me. I packed carefully the night before. I even baked a pumpkin pie using the same recipe my mother had taught me decades ago. As I drove across Washington, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. The roads were wet from morning rain. Still, my heart felt hopeful. I kept imagining laughter, stories, family. I thought maybe things would feel like they used to. Maybe I would feel close to my son again. But the moment I arrived, something felt different. My daughter-in-law greeted me politely. Very politely, too politely, the kind of politeness people use with strangers, not family. I told myself I was imagining things. Sometimes people are tired during the holidays. Sometimes stress changes the mood. I didn't want to start looking for problems. So I smiled. I helped in the kitchen. I offered to set the table. I did everything I could to make myself useful. But all day long, little things kept happening. Small things, things that seemed insignificant on their own, yet together they felt impossible to ignore. Conversations would stop when I entered the room. Plans would be discussed without including me. Jokes were shared that I wasn't part of. Several times, I found myself standing alone while everyone else talked together. I remember looking around the house and feeling strangely out of place, as if I had walked into someone else's celebration, as if I needed permission to be there. The feeling stayed with me all afternoon. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, deep inside. My son seemed distracted. Every time I tried to start a meaningful conversation, something interrupted us. His phone, a visitor, another task, another excuse. I told myself not to be sensitive. I told myself not to overthink, but loneliness has a way of speaking louder when you're surrounded by people. As evening approached, relatives and friends arrived. The house became crowded. Laughter echoed through the rooms. Everyone seemed comfortable, everyone except me. I sat quietly and watched, smiled when appropriate, nodded when people spoke, pretended everything was fine. Inside, though, my heart was growing heavier. Then dinner began. The table looked beautiful. Candles flickered softly. The smell of turkey filled the room. Everyone found their seats, and that's when I noticed something. There wasn't a place set for me. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, an oversight. Holiday gatherings can be hectic. I stood there awkwardly while everyone settled into their chairs. No one seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to say anything. I couldn't tell. Finally, my daughter-in-law looked up. "Oh," she said casually, "you can sit over there." She pointed toward a small folding table set up against the wall, away from everyone else, away from the conversation, away from the family table. For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. I waited for someone to laugh, for my son to say something, for anyone to say, "No, she belongs here." But nobody did. Nobody. The room continued moving around me as if nothing unusual had happened, as if placing a mother at a separate table was perfectly normal. I felt heat rush into my face. My hands suddenly felt cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Most of all, I couldn't believe my son stayed silent. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The way old glass develops a fracture that nobody notices until it's too late. I sat where they told me to sit. I smiled when people glanced my way. I ate almost nothing. And through the entire meal, I kept asking myself the same question. When did I stop being family? The drive home later that night felt longer than usual. The roads were dark. The rain had returned. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether I had been holding on to a relationship that no longer existed. I stared through the windshield and tried not to cry, but one painful thought refused to leave me. If my own son could watch me be treated that way and say nothing, what else had I been refusing to see? The days after Thanksgiving were the hardest, not because of what happened at the dinner table, but because of what happened afterward. Nothing. Absolute silence. I returned to my apartment carrying more pain than luggage. The drive back felt lonely, but I kept telling myself that maybe things would get better. Maybe my son would call. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would explain. I held on to those hopes longer than I should have. When you love someone deeply, you become skilled at making excuses for them, especially when that person is your child. The apartment felt unusually quiet when I walked inside. I placed my suitcase near the door and stood there for a moment. The silence wrapped around me. For years, I had kept that apartment because it allowed me to stay close to my son. Whenever he needed me, I could be there. Whenever there was a birthday, a holiday, or a family gathering, I was only a short drive away. At least, that was the reason I gave myself. But now, standing alone in that living room, I wasn't so sure anymore. I looked around and suddenly everything felt different. The furniture, the photographs, the little decorations I had carefully chosen over the years. Instead of feeling like home, the apartment felt like evidence of how much effort I had invested into staying connected, and how little that effort seemed to matter now. Days passed, then a week. My phone rarely rang. Every time it lit up, my heart jumped. Every time it wasn't my son, disappointment settled in again. I hated admitting that. At my age, I thought I would be wiser, stronger, less dependent on someone else's attention. But mothers never really stop being mothers, no matter how old their children become. When my son finally called, his voice sounded distant, polite. The same kind of politeness I had noticed from his wife. We talked about the weather, traffic, random things that meant nothing. Not once did he mention Thanksgiving. Not once did he ask if I was okay. Not once did he acknowledge what had happened. I waited. I kept expecting him to bring it up, but he never did. When the conversation ended, I sat there staring at my phone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, or rather, what I wasn't hearing. The silence spoke louder than words. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat near the window, watching rain slide down the glass. The city lights blurred in the darkness, and for the first time, I allowed myself to revisit old memories. Not the happy ones, the uncomfortable ones. The moments I had ignored, the moments I had explained away, the moments that suddenly made sense. I remembered birthdays where I had been invited at the last minute, family dinners where my opinions were dismissed, conversations where my daughter-in-law spoke over me as if I wasn't there, little comments disguised as jokes, little exclusions disguised as accidents. Back then, I told myself not to be sensitive. I told myself every family has misunderstandings. I told myself I was imagining things. Now, sitting alone in the dark, I realized something painful. I had spent years shrinking myself to keep the peace. Years. I had stayed quiet when I should have spoken, accepted things that hurt me, ignored disrespect because I was afraid of creating distance between myself and my son. The truth was difficult to face. The Thanksgiving dinner wasn't the beginning. It was simply the moment I could no longer pretend, the moment the pattern became impossible to ignore. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made, the years of working long hours, the nights I stayed awake worrying about bills, the opportunities I gave up so my son could have more. I never regretted any of it. Not once. A mother's love doesn't keep score, but I never imagined I would reach a point where I felt like a guest in my own son's life. That realization broke something inside me. Not my love for him. That remained. It always would. But the illusion that everything was fine, the illusion that if I tried harder, things would change, that illusion finally disappeared. One afternoon, I opened the drawer where I kept my lease paperwork. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. At least, that's what I told myself. Yet there I was, holding the documents, reading them slowly. My eyes stopped on the renewal date. I stared at the page for a long time. The apartment had always represented hope, a way to stay close, a way to remain part of my son's life. But suddenly, it felt like something else, a reminder of how desperately I had been trying to preserve a relationship that seemed increasingly one-sided. I sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, the paperwork resting in front of me, the room completely still. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches of winter trees. Inside, a question kept repeating itself in my mind, a simple question, one I had avoided for years. What if staying close wasn't bringing us closer? What if I was holding on to something that no longer existed? The thought frightened me, but strangely, it also brought a sense of peace. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what everyone else wanted. I was thinking about what I needed. And as I sat there staring at those lease papers, I began to realize that one difficult decision might change everything. I just wasn't ready to make it yet. Comes a moment in life when the truth becomes too heavy to carry. Not because it suddenly appears, but because you've spent years trying not to see it. For weeks after Thanksgiving, I lived inside that truth, quietly, painfully. Every morning I woke up hoping the feeling would fade. Every night I went to bed realizing it hadn't. The apartment that once there presented closeness now felt like a monument to disappointment. Every room reminded me of why I had stayed. Every corner reminded me of what I had lost. And somewhere between those sleepless nights and long, silent mornings, something inside me began to change, not all at once, slowly, like winter giving way to spring. One evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside me. The lease papers were spread out in front of me again. I had looked at them countless times over the previous weeks, always thinking, always hesitating, always finding another reason to wait. But that evening felt different. The sun was setting outside the window. Soft golden light filled the room. And for the first time in a very long time, I asked myself a question I had never truly considered. What if I stopped chasing people who weren't making room for me in their lives? The question startled me, because mothers aren't taught to think that way. We're taught to keep showing up, keep forgiving, keep waiting, keep hoping. And hope can be beautiful, but sometimes hope becomes a place where pain hides. I sat there for a long time, then I picked up the phone. The conversation with the leasing office lasted less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That was all it took. Years of emotional attachment, years of sacrifice, years of waiting. And with one phone call, it was over. When I hung up, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. A deep, quiet relief. I thought to myself, maybe this is what peace feels like. Not happiness, not excitement, just peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't organizing my life around someone else's choices. I was making my own. A few days later, my son called. At first, the conversation sounded ordinary. Then he asked about the apartment. Someone had mentioned my decision. The silence that followed his question felt heavy. I could hear confusion in his voice, maybe even concern. "You're really leaving?" he asked. I stared out the window. The trees outside were bare. Winter had settled in completely. "Yes," I said softly. Another silence, longer this time. Then came something I hadn't heard in months. Emotion, real emotion. He asked why. And suddenly years of unspoken feelings stood between us. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was simply tired of pretending. So I told him the truth. I told him how lonely I had felt. I told him how Thanksgiving had broken my heart. I told him how difficult it was to sit at a separate table while everyone else acted as though it was normal. My voice trembled, but I kept speaking. For once, I didn't stop myself. For once, I didn't minimize my pain to make someone else comfortable. When I finished, the line was quiet, very quiet. Then I heard something I never expected: regret. Not a dramatic apology, not a perfect speech, just regret. The kind that comes when someone finally sees the consequences of their silence. "I didn't realize," he said, and for a moment my heart broke all over again, because that was the problem. He hadn't realized, he hadn't noticed, or perhaps he hadn't wanted to. Either way, the result had been the same. I had spent years feeling invisible. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, not because I doubted his sincerity, but because I realized something important. Understanding the pain doesn't erase it. Love doesn't automatically heal every wound. Some things leave scars, and that's okay. Scars are proof that healing happened. As our conversation ended, I felt sadness, but not bitterness. Never bitterness. I still loved my son. I always would. Nothing could change that. But love no longer meant sacrificing my dignity. Love no longer meant accepting disrespect. Love no longer meant shrinking myself to fit into a place where I wasn't valued. That chapter of my life was ending. And strangely, I felt grateful. Not for the pain, not for the humiliation, but for the lesson. Because sometimes the people we love teach us something important without meaning to. They teach us our worth, not by how they treat us, but by showing us what we should never accept again. The day I handed over my apartment keys, I stood outside for a moment before leaving. The air was cold. The sky stretched endlessly above me. I looked back one last time, not with anger, not with regret, just acceptance. The woman who had first signed that lease years ago was not the same woman standing there now. She had spent years chasing closeness, years seeking approval, years waiting to be chosen. The woman walking away had learned something different. She had learned to choose herself. And as I drove toward the future, I realized something beautiful. Sometimes losing the place you've been holding on to is exactly how you find the place where you truly belong. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next.